Next on News Talk, AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show with Kevin Doran.
Ryan O'Neill in for Kevin Doran again, on with our regular Thursday guest, Dr. Christian Kopff. Dr. Kopff, thanks for calling in.
It's great to be talking to upstate New York.
Dr. Kopff, you wanted to talk media bias at the national level. I'll tell you, I was talking to an Atlanta reporter, a former Atlanta reporter. She used to work at Atlanta TV. She said that most of the reporters were good. The problem was their assignment editors would try to make it fit an agenda.
Yes, that's you hear that a lot from the people who know that they are trying to report, and they do report the facts, but that the people, do not trust the viewers, or they feel that their audience wants a certain response, and so they turn these stories into it's the rewrite department and the editorial staff. Yeah, that's very likely, and you do hear reporters complain about that, and most of them are not willing to lose their jobs, so they go along. Every once in a while, somebody actually says, "Excuse me, these are the facts, I'm not going to lie," and unfortunately they end up being fired, of course. The reporter's response is, it isn't their fault. If they don't go along with feeding the narrative, they will lose their jobs because these people want it a certain way. And that means the rot is at the top, not at the bottom. It's not hardworking reporters trying to get the facts. It's the editor and the people on top who are mandating this, and I'm afraid that's true.
And, you see this with Cheryl Atkinson, the former CBS reporter who stepped forward and said, hey, I had to leave CBS because they would not allow me to be critical of Obama and the administration at all.
No, she's a great example. We now have her book-length discussion of this, which is really interesting because she was a good reporter. She was very factual. She was looking for interesting stories and interesting angles on stories, and what she got was told that she simply had to give them what they wanted. And it's a problem. By the way, it's a problem, in teaching, too. There are teachers who encourage kids to sort of express different views, and there are teachers, often overworked teachers, who say, look, I wanted the paper to be this way, and I want the facts to be presented this way. And, it's a fault we all tend to have, but in the case of both teaching and the news, it's a terrible habit because we need to hear the stories based on fact that we're not hearing. We don't need to hear the same repetitive storyline.
Speaking of the way teachers tell you to write things, is it easier to catch plagiarism now that the internet is out there and a student can go copy and paste as opposed to in the old days when a student would get it out of a book and copy what was in the book, but they couldn't do the Control-C, Control-V thing?
Yeah, it's unbelievably easier now. There's no excuse except sloth for not catching plagiarism because the various websites and web pages that are out there. Now, sometimes the school has to pay for them, and some schools don't. Ours does. But it is now much easier to catch it, and every teacher has to be aware that even in the best classes, there'll be some plagiarism. And they need to be aware of that. It's now much easier to catch it. And the only problem you have is the brazen student who tells you, no, I didn't cheat. And you say, well, look at this web page and look at your paper. They're mirror images, What? You must have done it. But they've learned from the TV never to confess, right?
What's the in your view, Dr. Kopff, and you're a professor at University of Colorado in Boulder, what is the biggest cause or motivation for cheating? Is it wanting to get high grades or laziness?
That's a great question. I remember President Clinton was asked why he indulged in some activities that got him into trouble, and he said, because I could. There's a very small group that actually don't know what plagiarism is. There's a very small group that are so driven by grade obsession, but really the majority is sheer sloth. They don't want to work hard. They consider college a privilege. The way they're treated, often they have good reason to. They have bowling alleys and sports centers and fancy rooms and on and on.
All we had was foosball rooms.
Now, it's sad because it'll often be a student whose grades are not that bad, no reason to cheat, decent family background, right? They're not driven by poverty and fear of losing their scholarship, all these tragic cases. No, they just don't want to work hard.
We're talking with Dr. Christian Kopff. Oh, one other follow-up to that one, if I could. What's the worst example of a person who you knew cheated in college who went on in life and then got caught doing something where they were cheating in another way? Did you ever see any examples of that?
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't want to mention cases, but
You don't have to mention names.
fortunately, cheating as a college student is related to later going on and cheating. Because you get away with it. You're sure you can get away with it. It's why, and by the way, the pressure is enormous on schools to cover up cheating. There's just, the threats of suits and all the rest. But we're not helping students when we don't catch them when they're cheating. It's really part of our job to catch them when they're young, because you've just made the point, and I don't want to make with specific examples, that they then go out in life and they cheat. And then it can be disastrous. It'll be, if they're a lawyer, it can be a client's whole financial basis or even freedom. And in politics, it can be all kinds of terrible things happen. And, college can be a great time when you can make mistakes and learn, but there are some mistakes, especially that of plagiarism and cheating, which we need to catch and we need to punish. And you should feel the pressure that's on not to punish them. It's really something. They couldn't help themselves. We have to give everyone another chance. The parents are going to sue. The fear of suing is enormous on college campuses. And, among administrators. The faculty, by the way, this is the one thing where liberal, conservative, and extreme all agree that we need to maintain academic standards on the basic level of cheating. And administrations, they're worried, you don't understand, the kid was unhappy and the parents will sue. You hear this thing over and over again. It's terrible for those kids because they think they can get away with it, then later on in life they do something really terrible. And it's a tragedy.
It was not my little Johnny syndrome, is that worse than it used to be? I've heard that it is. Is that true?
I don't think it's worse necessarily. I was once involved in teaching a large class a number of years ago in which there had been obvious cheating at the midterm, but we weren't ready to handle it. So we made sure that in the final, it was a very large class. The final had to be a multiple choice one because the grades have to be in a certain number of hours. And we had somewhat eased it by having small writing assignments, which take longer to grade, but which you can really tell. We gave them the same test, but we rearranged the A, B, C, D answer. It was A on one, would be D on the next, and we hand them out alternating. So we could really tell cheating, because one person would have an A grade, and the other would have what would have been an A grade on the other test, except they answered the other test, not the one that they had. And I got called by several people who said, this can't be true. This is a wonderful person. This person can't have cheated. And I said, believe me, the evidence is unquestionable. We're not talking about one or two mistakes. We're talking about a pattern of cheating which is shown, and I showed it to the dean. The really serious cases of cheating, the deans do get involved in. And there were people who were being very, groomed for law school, groomed for graduate school in a science that were caught absolutely cheating in a course on Greek mythology, which should have been quite clear. So I don't think it's gotten worse, but I do think it's bad. And people who really study this, I have a good friend who's involved with our own student honors group that looks at this. And he says, he tells every faculty member, if you think there's no cheating in your class, you haven't been looking. There is cheating in every class. There is cheating of course, in large classes it's pandemic, but in smaller classes, even so, there's cheating on papers. And so it is a problem in our system.
Do you think that Cliff Notes is cheating, Dr. Kopff?
Say it again?
Do you think that Cliff Notes is cheating?
I don't consider it cheating, but I don't consider it cheating. I don't see. I mean, if a person only uses the Cliff Notes and doesn't read the book, then you're not doing the work. Yes, and you need to ask questions in class and on your exams that can't be answered by Cliff Notes. But people are not taught to read in high school. I hate to say this. There are wonderful public schools and wonderful private and parochial schools in this country, but there are also non-wonderful ones. And kids do come to college not able to read challenging literature. And Cliff Notes, if they're doing the reading and using Cliff Notes is a wonderful aid. If you're doing Cliff Notes and not doing the reading, then yes, you're cheating.
We're talking with Dr. Christian Kopff, University of Colorado in Boulder. Brian O'Neill in for Kevin Doran today. Back in just a moment on the Newsmaker Show. Brian O'Neill in for Kevin Doran on the Newsmaker Show with our regular Thursday guest, Dr. Christian Kopff. Dr. Kopff, this week Arnie Duncan and the Education Department came out with a whole new list of rules and regulations for teachers. I went to the link from the website that I had read it on, that there was a new list of regulations. I thought, okay, let's see what there are. And it was this slideshow, a slide presentation. So I kept clicking the slides. I couldn't find one rule or one regulation. Your thoughts on these new regulations? Do you know what they are?
Well, yes, you're bringing up the difficulty of getting a straight answer from the Department of Education. But I do know the general philosophy behind it, which they've talked about, which is that they need to raise standards in schools of education, in teacher prep programs. And this has long time been untouchable because the teachers' unions are very powerful. Although teachers' unions are basically about K through 12, after all, and schools of education are in universities. But that's the one part of the university that's constant contact with K through 12. And the teachers' unions are very influential there, and they don't like changing the way things are going. And what Arnie Duncan is saying is that we need to have higher standards when people are in schools of education. Secondly, we need higher standards for people accepted into schools of education. And thirdly, the schools need to be tested by how successful their teachers are when they get out there teaching, not by whether they have a certain curriculum and claim they're doing certain things. And these are all very reasonable claims if they can be worked out. Let me talk about the second issue, the issue of how you get into schools of education. Basically, most schools of education have open admissions for those who can pay. They're incredible cash cows for their schools. They make a lot of money for their schools, and schools depend upon the tuition from successful programs because, engineering and programs like that are usually in the red. And ed schools are almost always in the black, and considerably so. The problem is they get that way because they accept anybody. And these people then get degrees, and they then go out and teach. And C students do not become A teachers. Now, one doesn't want to be too strict, and there are very good, B plus people who are wonderful human beings and can learn a topic and can become a good teacher. But one big difference between us and places like India, places like Europe, is that it's relatively hard to become a teacher. And in this country, it is relatively easy to become a teacher. And once you're in, it's not impossible, but relatively hard to get rid of bad teachers. And one way to help with that problem, not the only way, not a cure-all, is to raise the standards for getting into ed school. You have to have a certain average. You have to have a certain success as an undergraduate. And it could really, you have to show you're already successful in education. And law schools and med schools all insist on this too. And they even not only they take grade point in the GPA, they also take their own special tests they make people take, which don't exist for ed schools. So the general philosophy behind what Arnie Duncan is doing seems to be a good one. I think you're hinting that the devil's in the details, and right now it's hard to figure out exactly how these good philosophical notions are going to be exemplified without imposing a very heavy-handed federal burden on ed schools.
Well, all I could find was a bunch of vague slides which were written for, or acted like it seemed to be written for like 4-year-olds. I'm like, okay, happy, joy. What are the new regulations? And you say that's a common problem. On the IRS, Dr. Kopff, a couple of issues there. One, the White House was given over 2,000 files about people by the IRS, and two, the IRS has given refunds to prisoners who don't pay taxes anyway. Starting out with the IRS files being given to the White House. Wow, your take on that?
Well, it's a very shocking situation. There has always been a danger with the income tax from its initial founding that it would be used not to raise money for the government, but to find out what people were earning, find out what their financial dealings are. And that, of course, didn't used to exist until about the second decade of the 20th century, because before that time, the government was funded by the tariff, which is fees on foreigners, and by excise taxes, which are sin taxes on alcohol and tobacco. And it's actually, we should view ourselves as lucky that it's taken almost a century for the IRS to become so corrupt, because for a long time they would not indulge in these activities. But currently, we've had all the bad effects of a system in which they know a lot of information about people they shouldn't know, and they are now sharing this with the White House. They get a lot. The people in prisons who have nothing but spare time file to receive money back from the government, even though they're A, not working, and B, are in jail. And although most of them get turned down, hundreds of thousands of dollars are given to prisoners every year as part of mistaken payment from overpaid of taxes, which they haven't done. So we have both the IRS working hand in glove with the White House to get information on its enemies, and also in irresponsible expenditures, which by themselves we could handle, but you add up all the other problems, and we're $18 trillion in debt heading toward 20. And the IRS is part of the problem. It's not part of the solution.
And your take on the IRS giving refunds to prisoners?
Yeah, it's. By the way, prisoners have learned that they can apply, and because anybody can, and they apply for about $1 billion worth. The IRS catches almost all of them. That still leaves about $700,000 that they're handing out to people, and it's the system needs to be built so that it can't be gamed so easily. And meanwhile, not only are these people not working to make sure that this isn't happening successfully enough, they are working to make sure much of it isn't paid, but then they get automatic bonuses no matter how incompetent or corrupt they are. And, bonuses make perfect sense in a free market system where if somebody does extra good work, they get a reward. But these people are not in a free market system. They are just showing up for work, and although some of them are hardworking, there's no question about that, some of them are not hardworking. They're not catching enough of these obvious cases of abuse, like paying money off to people in prison, or like handing over the files of political enemies of the White House to the White House. And it's something needs to be done starting from scratch, I think, at this stage. We're talking about a system which no longer functions as it was set up to do, and we need to do something dramatic about it. Now, this is much more important than most of the other things they're talking about, because the IRS is now an out-of-control rogue agency. As I say, the good news is it took 100 years for this to happen, but the bad news is it's happening, and it's happening now.
Final question for you, Dr. Christian Kopff. The decline of Budweiser and the rise of microbreweries, and we're down to about a minute.
Well, the fun news is that Budweiser has had serious drop-off in its sales, and they're going to appeal to millennials. And the great news is that we had, 1,000 breweries in this country in 1900. By 1980, Budweiser and their friends had reduced it to about 200. We're now back up to 1,000 again. There's a lot of good beer in this country, and the thought that Budweiser, by advertising, is going to win us back to drink their mediocre beer instead of the delicious, Colorado happens to be a center for microbreweries, so the delicious microbrewery beer is the case of people believing in advertising can overcome reality. And it isn't happening, it isn't working so far, and I don't think it's going to work.
Dr. Christian Kopff, University of Colorado in Boulder, it's always great having you on.
Terrific to talk to you.